Quickly, are we recording? Oh,
yes.
Yes.
You need to say that and then it starts.
Hello, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is the fourth in a five-part series of the GDN annual meeting webinars, part one. We will have the second five starting in September. I'm going to turn the mic over to Daniel, who will start us off.
Okay, good morning, but maybe also good evening and good afternoon, as this is a global. I'm very happy to be here and have the honor and pleasure to moderate this session on using innovation to disrupt and creating a sustainable digital ecosystem for learning, and more specific, power to the people with self-sovereign identity. My name is Daniel Duseuil, and I'm the ESIF convener, the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework convener for the European Union and for the European Blockchain Partnership. So this topic is something that is, of course, very close to what I work on and what the passion is, but it's also very related to education, because the first steps that I took with the self-sovereign identity framework in Europe were initially based in the educational field. When I worked in Belgium as also blockchain partnership member, we also looked at project, okay, what were the challenges in education to share data, student data between countries? There was a topic that was causing problems, challenges in the last 20 to 30 years, and we couldn't solve those kind of things. So we looked at new technology. How can we, when a student comes from another country, share that data in a transparent way? But all the things that we try to figure out, were always lacking or having troubles with one fundamental thing, and that was the identity. We have a system in this world where identity is related to national systems, to national borders, to cross-sector borders. So to challenge those kind of things, you need a new approach of identity. You need a new thing about how you can solve education or improve mobility with a new paradigm of identity. And that's very interesting for this session to see what are the links between that new concept of self-sovereign identity with education. Uh, this is, of course, something that already been discussed in a few sessions of the Groningen Declaration session, but I'm very happy to have here today in this session and a very active member of that ecosystem, namely Digitary. And in that firm, Takis Diakomanis, will be saying it in the right way, is a Chief Technology Officer, and he will be introducing the concept of self-sovereign identity and why this is very important for education and all the credentials. Digitary is, of course, a firm that is very active in this, and we're going to see how this is going to implement and how this new concept, this new project can be applied. I will be moderating the session, but I will giving, of course, the floor to Takis. If you have any questions during the session, we are in a limited group, so we can have some interaction and we can have some discussion. So don't be shy or modest or afraid to use the chat or the Q&A to ask questions. So I will be giving you the floor if you have. Takis also agrees if there are some urgent topics, let us know. We put that question on and we start discussing those kind of things. So please use it, as we are in a limited group, to use the interaction as much as possible. But I'm very happy and to give now the floor to Takis and with his interesting presentation. Okay, Takis, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for that quite informative introduction to self-sovereign identity, and indeed in your work, which I've actually had a bit of a crash course on since we met a few weeks ago. In your work, you've actually achieved a lot with you and your team in progressing, I guess, the movement and getting that sort of bandwidth happening in Europe in particular, and hopefully beyond. So I'll kick off my screen share. All right, so hopefully you can all see that now.
Yes, we can.
Great. All right, so Today we're going to talk about self-sovereign identity, and we're going to, what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover a little bit of some of the ideals or the values and the philosophies behind self-sovereignty, self-sovereign identity. And I'd like to attempt to hook it back into learners and the global mobility movement that is learners, and indeed some of the key tenets that the Credential Declaration aspires to and put down on paper many years ago now. This year's theme of using innovation to disrupt, I think, is especially fitting for something like SSI, like self-sovereign identity, because I certainly believe that that is exactly what it's doing. It's disrupting not only the way learners move about and assert their credentials, it's disrupting the way many businesses, organisations, governments and people in general globally conduct some of the critical parts and aspects of their lives. So that's myself and Daniel presenting here. So like Daniel said, I'm CTO at a company called Digitary. Digitary is in the business of supplying credential issuing systems to predominantly higher education institutions all over the world. And our journey has taken us to using any number of different sort of technologies and mechanisms and models, so that we're able to support a broad range of, I guess, technological maturity in different organisations or indeed even countries. Thank you again to Daniel as the convener of the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework. It's a critical role to promote and continue to promote and encourage the adoption of self-sovereign identity and the ideals that we aspire to with it. So let's start by talking a little bit about lifelong learning, which is a phrase certainly within the higher education sector in particular, and certainly within the Credential network that we hear a lot. So let's recap a little bit about what we're trying to achieve. So we're talking about lifelong learning as a continuous pursuit of knowledge. And we all subscribe to being able to support people to move through their lives, being able to pick up skills and evolve who they are. And this is also both in formal and informal settings. What we've learnt over time is that learning can take different forms. It can happen in different environments. It can happen in cathedral settings, if you like, of a formal institution like a university or a college, or it can happen in the workplace. It can happen in outdoor education centres. It can happen in all manner of things. And what we like to do is use that to evolve who we are and help us improve where we're headed. One of the key aspects of lifelong learning, of course, is mobility and employability. Of course, we learn for curiosity, but we also learn to improve our employment opportunities and improve what we can achieve for ourselves, for our community, for our nation, and for the wider global community as well. And one of the key things that lifelong learning, in fact, recognises is that these days, we actually sometimes have more than one career. And we can have a number of different sort of life pivots, if you like, where we change direction. I know a number of people who started as, for example, lawyers and have ended up being scientists. A number of engineers in mechanical sort of realms who are now doctors. So it's a recognition again of the fact that it's a continuum and we continue to evolve. And as a part of that, what we try to do is we try to equip learners with the best tools so that they can go through this process, this metamorphosis, if you like, as we go on. And what we want to be able to do as a part of that is tell our best story. We'd like to present our best selves to the community, to our employers, to the onward education and so forth, so that we can achieve that next level within our pursuit. So let's look at some of the ways we support learner mobility. And it's interesting that the Credential Declaration, which was in 2012, was one of the key, was a key recognition of the fact that we want to be able to have essentially unfettered movement of learners and skilled workers. And we wanted to do that by supporting the portability of academic credentials. And we wanted to promote standards And we wanted to promote interoperability and how these learners can move from institution to institution, state to state, country to country, as we see more broadly, given the movement of learners, COVID notwithstanding at the moment, but typically the movement of learners globally is absolutely enormous. And we want to be able to achieve all of that whilst maintaining strict rules and strict laws governing privacy and security. And you'll see a number of different regulations globally that have taken hold, led in fact by the Europeans with their GDPR framework, which has in itself become a de facto privacy framework that a lot of other countries have adopted or have looked to inform how some of their privacy acts and some of their legislation might work within the sort of world and the digital space that we operate in. And we want to support people by providing sharing mechanisms for their lifelong learning. So once I have my credential, how can I move it from sort of A to B? If I get it from one institution, how can I present it to an employer? How can I present it to a professional association that would like to assess whether or not I have a specific award to be a member of that association? And we do that, of course, by being able to assert our claims to knowledge. And that's the underlying thing. That's the key point of what it is learners are trying to do to support their onward journey. So let's look a little bit about credentials and the credential space in which we generally, I guess, inhabit. Today, we use a number of different artifacts to prove our identity or assert something about ourselves. Interestingly, here in Australia, and I think it's the case in many other countries, we've got a point system. So for example, for me to go up the road to my local bank and open a bank account, I need to present what is known as 100 points of ID. And what those points of ID essentially represent is that different credentials have different value and they're categorized in different ways. So a birth certificate, for example, I think is worth 60 or 70 points. A driver license might be worth 30 or 40 points and so forth. And what I need to do is I need to collate all of these different credentials and present them to the bank to essentially assert who I am, such that I'm not defrauding the bank or what have you. Now, what's interesting about that is that we assert who we are through the issuers. We assert who we are through the issuers as trusted agents. So for example, our driver license, it could probably be issued by a local state authority, like in the US, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or in the state of Victoria where I am, there's an organisation called Vic Roads that issues the driver license. They're asserting who I am based on the license through their agency. And what that essentially means is that there's a trust channel through that agency because we trust that agency. The difference, or the online version of that, is a lot of the social networks and a lot of the professional networks, like your Facebooks or your Google or LinkedIn or some of the others. And they collect your information and they act as trust agents on your behalf. And what they do is they assert who you are, but they do it on their terms. And that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky and a little bit slippery. And further to that, in order to do it, what they tend to do is they start to collect a large number of data points about you, about me, about everybody. And they store that in central locations. And of course, those central locations storing all of this private information, it's traded. And of course, it can be stolen en masse. As you can imagine, it is a very attractive honeypot for any bad actor to come on in and breach those systems and take that information and use it for bad purposes. So bringing that back into the academic credential sort of landscape, let's have a look at some of the credentials and some of the sharing mechanisms and what the general environment looks like for learners today. So today we've currently got millions of documents that are shared globally. Learners share their documents in a number of formats. Interestingly, a lot of them continue to be paper. A lot of them continue to be paper that are sent from source, and that is from the institution they may have attended to the institution they want to go to, or perhaps the employer, or it could be a government agency somewhere for a visa application or similar. They will send paper documents on the odd occasion, or rather more frequently now, you also have electronic documents using platforms, in fact, like ours with Digitary, that allows you to share your credentials, your academic credentials in different ways using signed PDFs, for example. You even had instances where learners will share their documents in an electronic format that is essentially an image, a photo they've taken of their document with their phone or something similar. The key to all of this is always being able to, from a verifier's point of view, is to ensure that the origin is legitimate. So again, it brings you back to that agency notion and back to the issuer being the key to achieving that level of trust, to establishing the trust channel between the verifier and you, the holder of that verification of that credential, to be able to assert who you are. Now, what that of course does is it introduces any number of verification and attestation challenges. So what determines that a credential that's being presented, especially across borders, especially electronically, what determines that to be valid? How can you trust the source? How can you determine that what the learner is presenting, for example, is in fact real and a true representation of themselves? And of course, the recipients of all of these digital credentials have to manage and they have to store them. And these will be typically stored within, for example, admission application systems, within university centres themselves, within data centres that universities maintain or control. And of course, you get back to that central storage point for all these credentials with learners moving through different boundaries and borders. Now, trust is at the centre of everything we do to support learners, both at Digitary and I think more broadly, again, referring back to the Coronation Declaration. Now, we found that trust is always key for us, and trust in issuers of the credentials, trust in learners to be able to securely articulate their awards, and trust in our underlying technology and platform. So trust is at the center of every single interaction that we have, either as a recipient of a credential, so in the case of, say, a verifier, or when as holders we're presenting something we've received as a proof to a verifier that we have achieved or we are asserting a claim and it is true. For us, SSI, we believe SSI is that next level of trust in a digital world, and it begins to fill the gaps present in our broader digital landscape. The fact, for example, that the internet lacks that identity layer. And with that, the vacuum is being filled by other networks. So it's not so much that some of the social networks or professional networks that referred to earlier are specifically bad actors. What they're essentially doing is they're filling a vacuum that essentially the ecosystem more broadly sort of presented 20, 25 or more years ago, in fact. But the problem is still that those networks still assert who we are on our behalf, but on their terms. So let's talk a little bit about self-sovereignty. Now, self-sovereignty reflects the core values and the accepted notions of what we typically define as, or what we've in fact have defined as universal human rights. The right to control your personal information and assert who you are, using that information and in fact, critically not using or relying on a third party that perhaps does not have our best interests at heart when they do that for us. Now, self-sovereignty or self-sovereign identity these fundamental points of self-sovereign identity was first or best articulated initially by Christopher Allen in 2016. And I encourage everyone to check out this link and read this piece, The Path to Self-Sovereignty. As with other philosophies and movements, an examination of the past to provide context for where we are today is very, very important. And Chris Allen does that beautifully here. And he works through the different phases and the different points, the evolutionary points of digital identity and how we sort of got to the point at which we got to, and what some of the aspirations are for self-sovereignty and what it means. As a part of that piece, Chris Allen concludes with the principles of self-sovereignty, and he's defined 10 principles of self-sovereignty. Interestingly, if you were to watch some recent videos by Christopher Allen, he actually talks about how these 10 principles now 5 years or so down the track are at the point where they're probably up for review. So whether that's a renewal, a reaffirmation, or indeed perhaps they're open to change. How have we evolved over the last 4 or 5 years? Indeed, our understanding of what self-sovereignty is over the last 4 or 5 years, how has that evolved, and how could that be used to inform perhaps a modified set of principles? But in any case, these 10 principles are the cornerstone of what we talk about, or what we know and believe of self-sovereignty to be. What's interesting about these in Christopher Allen's foundational piece, the 10 critical items, they attempt to ensure that individuals remain at the center of self-sovereign systems, and that the technology and the ecosystems that naturally, organically grow with all the work that we do around us continue to balance fairness and transparency, and always protect the individual and ensure that the rights of the individual are not violated. One of the key points out of that is that in terms of the individual being critical and central, is that whether it's a state or an organisation, they're more resilient than an individual, and that is one of the reasons we elevate the individual to be of critical importance and worthy of protection at almost any cost. Now, all of these principles reflect completely what we aspire to for learners, and indeed, again, what the Groningen Declaration set out to achieve with its core policy. So let's have a look how self-sovereignty relates to learners and relates to the lifelong learner journey.
Maybe Takis, if I can interrupt you a bit. With the term self-sovereignty, or more the sovereignty, there's a lot of discussion in the community about that term. Maybe you can also give your opinion about, is that the best term that we have on sovereignty? Or because sovereignty gives also the indication we control everything and we can also erase certain things. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, okay, that's a curly one early on.
Yeah, sorry.
That's actually a really interesting question. Look, I like the term. It's interesting. We use the word control, and one of the things with self-sovereignty, indeed, with some of my earlier reading with self-sovereignty, when I started to, I guess, digging deeper and deeper and get more consuming the philosophies and some of the ideals and the values behind it, was this difference between ownership and control. Where initially, for me, it was more about ownership, and part of that was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to a degree because of the way I think we have been. I was going to use. We've been used a little bit by the various networks and the various players out there that masquerade as sort of trust channels on our behalf. And it was always about reclaiming ownership of our information and ownership of our data. But for me, self-sovereignty, it does encapsulate that notion of control. It does. And when you tie that into some of the technology that we're going to talk about, and some of the technology that's used, for example, immutable distributed ledgers and so forth and so on, and your revocation rights to be forgotten and so forth as well, hooking into some of the GDPR notions. I guess self-sovereignty as a term, back to your question, is up for a little bit of debate. I think I still generally subscribe to the core tenets as defined by the 10 principles. Self-sovereignty as a term still makes sense to me, because for me now, and it could be because of the reading that I've tried to do, but for me, it resonates with that notion of control. Mm-hmm. And it resonates in terms of me being able to control my information and how I use that information and how I can present myself to anybody who would like to know something about me, or that I have to prove something to them about me. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but
yeah, thank you. It's also a question about, of course, if you come from a state or a government level, you'll be challenged with that term, and that's also something that we see in other interactions with organizations. But right. I think you perfectly answered my question and my remark. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, look, it's a great point, and interesting, weaving it into, in fact, what we're going to talk about here in terms of self-sovereignty and learners. What we find again is that SSI does reinforce the key tenets of the Groningen declaration and what we'd like to aspire for learners, what we'd like to achieve for learners and help them on their onward journey. We believe that in empowering learners to achieve their dreams, we can help them do that by putting power and control back to the learner and have less of a reliance on third parties to assert their claims. We want to support learners presenting the best version of themselves. So we start at this point talking about curated profiles. You know, how can I perhaps cherry pick from some of my achievements, perhaps some of my credentials, to present my best self for my next opportunity in my onward journey. And what we also like to do, especially with some of the tools that we build, is we want to use it to complement current offerings and enhance the learner experience. So what we're saying, especially at these early stages of self-sovereignty, and certainly with some of the platforms and the ecosystems that are slowly emerging globally, what we're essentially saying is that we're trying to hold both. We're trying to have a foot in this new world whilst also maintaining the old. And we think that bridge is important to make sure that everyone eventually comes along with us. And it also acknowledges that everyone is at a different stage. And that can be an organisation, a learning institution, or an individual. Whether it's the concepts or the technology, we all get to it in our time and within our own sort of journey. So that's what we would like to achieve in terms of self-sovereignty for learners. Now, let's talk very briefly about, or a little bit about dipping into the architecture. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technology that underpins some of these concepts of self-sovereignty, or rather are able to deliver some of the digital solutions with self-sovereignty that we've been talking about. Now, decentralization is a critical aspect of self-sovereignty, and distributed ledgers, in fact, or blockchain technology has emerged as the new paradigm in this decentralized world. And we know, whether it's through press with some of the Bitcoin ledgers that have come up, or through what I like to call more sophisticated value-based systems like self-sovereignty. These help us because data is uniquely registered within these, and it's immutable, and it's distributed across a broad network, a wide network across the world. The data is validated using consensus mechanisms, and it operates without a centralized or federated authority. And again, that is one of the key aspects that we talked about earlier, or one of the key problems, in fact, that we're trying to address with self-sovereignty, and some of the issues that we've seen. And the point here is that as the enabler, blockchain technology helps us achieve self-sovereignty in a secure, scalable, most of the time, and importantly, in a distributed way. So let's, within some of the philosophical value points that we talked about earlier, and overlaying some of these architectural technical principles with blockchain and so forth, let's take a look at the learner journey through a self-sovereign interaction. So
maybe, Taki, sorry to interrupt you again. We have, I think, an interesting question about Anthony Mahanoa, who asked him a bit about SSI and the learners. But in this concept where a student indeed controls his own data and controls his own interactions, his question is about, okay, one of the challenges from universities can be the best self. How can you reduce the risk that the students only present themselves as the best way of itself, not hiding certain things that could be relevant? So maybe you can give your thoughts on those kind of things, or is this coming further in your learning journey?
Yeah, well, I guess we're starting to cover a little bit, heading down towards a proof request, and I've got a proof request example later on. Now, with the information that an institution can request, the institution can specifically request the attributes that they would like the learner to present as a part of it. And I do have an example later, so I'll wait a little bit for the mechanical pieces in there. Yeah. I get the point. You're absolutely right. We're not, the point of a curated profile, or what the term that I would use to describe it as a curated profile, or cherry picking different things, is not so much an attempt to fool if you like, someone requesting a proof, like an institution or something that wants to accept someone into a course. It's essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to collate the best parts of what we've achieved to present a more holistic view to an employer or to an institution, yes, to better our chances in there. So I think if we balance that notion with the fact that the institution can still request specific attributes from the learner, which we'll see a little bit later, I think we do find a bit of a sweet spot there where both the learner's interest in terms of being able to represent or present themselves in the best possible light, like we always like to do, and the institution protecting themselves to ensure that they're getting candidates, if you like, that can progress to, you know, let's say a advanced degree or something. I think that balance can be achieved. It is delicate, I agree, and like the question suggests, we're certainly, again, we're not trying to fool systems out there. We're actually trying to strengthen a lot of those systems and present viable and accurate representations of people. But again, let's wait for the proof request a little bit later on. But it's a great question. It's a really good question. So the learner journey, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about Zoe. And Zoe went to university at the University of Western Hobart. Now, the University of Western Hobart is a fictitious university. It doesn't actually exist. We use it a lot in our examples, and you'll see it in some of the pictures that I've got later on as well. Now, Zoe has successfully completed her university degree at the University of Western Hobart. And the University of Western Hobart, in fact, she's quite fortunate because it uses, in this case, the Sovereign Network, which is an implementation, blockchain implementation of supporting self-sovereign identity. Uses the Sovereign Network to place its DID, which is a distributed identifier. A distributed identifier is essentially a URL, if you like, that defines the attributes, or rather links to the attributes of an organization, like, for example, the university, and it has that next to its what we call its schema definition, which is a description of how a particular credential might be presented, or the data points that are involved. Now, that schema definition and their DID, the distributed identifier, is on the ledger. So on completion of Zoe's degree, Zoe can create a connection with the University of Western Hobart, and she creates a connection through her digital wallet app, and that is an app that is in their phone, and digital wallets are emerging, and there's a number of them on the market at the moment. I'll show you one in a second. And Zoe uses her digital wallet app to create that trust channel, and that trust channel creates a unique identifier, or a unique pair of identifiers between the University of Western Hobart and Zoe. And that's called a pairwise distributed identifier. What's interesting about that is it actually resides off the ledger. And that is one of the key points of some of these technologies, and a key differentiator between some of the earlier applications of credentials on blockchain or distributed ledgers, is that a lot of the interactions and a lot of the identifiers actually occur and exist off the ledger itself. And it's the issuer that is essentially is the key resident on the ledger, which again echoes back to some of those earlier points we made around the issuer or the agency being the critical part of the interaction in determining that the bona fides of the credential holder are real. So the verifiable credential has been now issued to Zoe, and Zoe, on her lifelong learning journey, would like to now apply for an advanced degree at another institution. And that other institution could be anywhere in the world, local or global. And what they do is they then create a connection with that second institution. And again, you can see that that's created another set of identifiers between the institution and Zoe. And again, that represents a second trust channel. And that trust channel is private and peer-to-peer and unique to Zoe and the institution. And the institution can then ask for particular proof requests. And those proof requests can contain the set of attributes or the relevant attributes they would like to see from Zoe. That could be, for example, a GPA score or that they've completed a certain award. And we'll have an example of that shortly as well. That's the general high-level version of the interaction. And what we'll do now is we'll actually go into some of the work that we did to bring this off the illustration, if you like, and then using our platform, the Digitree platform, and the Sovereign Network, working with a company called Evening. We created a very viable proof of concept where we were able to explore how some of these interactions would really work in the real world with real learners. Now, our goals...
Maybe Takis, before you go jump in that, I have also a bit of question. If you go back one slide, if you can. Of course, there's a bit a technical picture, not technical question, but the question of James Geevy, and it's maybe related to broader questions. Yeah, how does classical, to name it in a classical way, definitions of formal, non-formal, and informal, or maybe definition and standardization that have emerged in the educational field, how does they apply in this kind of scheme? Yeah? Is it still valid, or are we inventing new kind of definition and terminologies, ontologies, or how you see this?
I'll just see if I understand the question. No, they're still valid. We're not redefining the attributes that make up a particular credential. What we're doing is we're presenting them in a digital space. So you're not going to take your formal and your informal, or rather you will take your formal and your informal learning credentials that you've achieved, and you'd putting them within your digital wallet. What they do is that they're representing a definition that is reflected on the ledger as determined by the university, like you see with Western Hobart. I hope I've explained that correctly, or clearly. So the University of Western Hobart, for example, will say that its award or the credential that it's issuing is made up of these attributes. Now, those attributes will reflect the physical world. They will reflect the attributes that they would typically get, whether it's on a transcript or on an award. And actually, in the example that we'll see going down, it's a simplified example, but in the use case that we'll have a look at, you can actually see some of those specific points reflected in the digital credential as they are in the physical credential, because I'll show you a picture of the physical credential and how they sort of map. Does that sort of answer that question a little bit? I hope that's clear.
James, let me know if that answers your question, but I think it is, that there is indeed a relationship with both of things. Yeah? We are not inventing on those kind of things. We are relying on those kind of things. Yeah? So,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. James confirms. Thank you, Takis.
Awesome. All right. So like any venture into new tech, it was really important for us to determine what we wanted to achieve, right? So it wasn't about really blockchain or self-sovereignty or whatever being a little bit of a hammer looking for a nail. It was about, within our problem space, how can this technology help us? So we were going to measure, it was about determining what our measure of success would be along the classic journey that we saw in the previous slide. And a clear articulation of what our goals were and what it offers learners, but not only learners and the institutions, and indeed verifies, be they employers or in fact other institutions, government departments and so forth. It was important that we see, can we determine measures of success that could fit in those 3 or 4 or in fact more categories. Everything was important at this point, including what our existing infrastructure was, what our technology stack looked like. We wanted to look at our team, in fact. Did we need to skill up in anything? Were there any concepts or technologies that we weren't familiar with before and needed to skill up on in order to be able to achieve some of these goals, as ambitious as they were? And a critical element underpinning all of this, in fact, was what's the user experience? What does the user actually see? How much of this blockchain or self-sovereignty, in fact, as a thing do they see? How much do they need to understand? How much will that or the technology get in the way of what it is they're trying to achieve? So essentially focusing on the job to be done. And what we came up with was 4 goals. And the 4 goals that we had with our proof of concept was to essentially establish connections to learners. And that was that first part of that journey that we saw earlier. Authenticate learners using these connections. That wasn't represented in that previous illustration, but it was one of the key goals that we wanted to explore. Issue an academic credential and support a proof request to complete that circle. Now, what we'll do here is we'll kick off with it's a recorded video. I'm not going to be clicking through the actual screens. I've recorded a video of these interactions. So we're going to have a look at the first few goals where we establish a connection with the learner. And then we begin to leverage that connection, that trust channel that we talked about, that is a peer-to-peer connection, and all interactions happen off the ledger to issue an academic credential into the learner's digital wallet. Now, what you've got here is you've actually got two screens. On the left-hand side, you've actually got a little bit of a snapshot of part of our platform, the Digitree Learner Portal. And on the right-hand side, you've actually got the digital wallet on a mobile phone. Now, the digital wallet that we're using is a product called Connect.me or Connect.me from Evening. And Evening were our partners on this journey. And they were the real experts in self-sovereign tech that sort of helped us, I guess, get as far along as we did, as quickly as we did. So I'll play this video, and you can have a look here that Zoe has a, excuse me, a transcript from the University of Western Hobart that we talked about earlier. And she's going to have a look at her transcript that she has been issued. And you can see the transcript has quite a level of granularity. You've got some top level information, including their name, the course they undertook. And then as you go down, you've got specific results on various subjects that Zoe completed. Now, what Zoe would like to do is download this transcript to her wallet. And the first thing that they will do, I'll actually pause it just before they, all right, so I'll just pause it here briefly. So this is now the first screen that a learner will see. Now, again, one of the challenges that we had here, and a little bit of what I touched on earlier, was how much of self-sovereignty or the self-sovereignty concepts or philosophies do we need to expose, for lack of a better word, to the learner? How much of a reach is that for them to actually understand what is happening? Or should we simplify it and put it in language that is a little bit more familiar, using, you know, different terms and labels and different processes that a learner is going to understand, and is going to be able to better sort of assimilate what is actually happening with her credential here. So we've tried to make it as easy and as clear as possible for the learner to get what we're trying to do. Now, this actually gives you a bit of a tip on if you don't have a digital wallet, it could be a different one other than Connect.me. We're suggesting Connect.me in this case because of our work with Evening. Plus, it's a pretty good app. And the assumption here, or in fact, you can see that from the right-hand side, they do actually already have it installed. So we'll continue. The first thing that will happen is it will create an invitation to connect. Now, this invitation is coming from the platform. And from here, using the app, they will scan that QR code and they will create a unique connection now between the platform and the learner. Once that connection is established, the platform will now send an invitation back to the wallet using that trust channel between now Digitree and the learner and their digital wallet app to receive their credential. And you can see how this happens. So you can see on the right-hand side, I'll just pause it here again. So this gives you a preview. Now, this is a subset. Now, this is the schema that we talked about earlier in the previous illustration. Now, for the demo, and indeed for our proof of concept, we had a very simplified schema. And we only really were interested in a handful of data points, I guess, to help us along in terms of validating some of our assumptions and you know, informing some of the direction that we were headed in. So this captures some top level information of where they went to school, the University of Western Hobart there, whether the degree was awarded, and a GPA, perhaps a major or what have you. So we'll continue with that. Now they choose to accept that credential. And what will happen afterwards is the credential will be sent to Zoe's digital wallet, which is happening now. And again, this is all off ledger. And you can see now within Zoe's digital wallets, you've got a credential from, in this case, Digitary, our platform, has a digital learner profile. It's just a term that we used. And it has a credential with 9 attributes representing their award from the University of Western Hobart. So that's the typical interaction that we see for a learner on a platform that would issue a digital credential using self-sovereign identity. So there were a couple of key elements in that. The first was the connection itself. So now once we've established that connection, we actually now have a trust channel between the platform, or Digitary rather, and the learner that we can then use for all manner of things, including downloading more credentials. And of course, one of our other goals, which I won't be demonstrating, which was to authenticate on the platform so they can just scan a QR code and be let in. Hang on a sec, let's go. All right. So let's talk about proofs, which is the next stage, that the right-hand side of our journey that we saw earlier. Now, each attribute in a credential is actually individually signed by the issuer using a unique key. Now, the issuer has a private key per attribute, and what it allows a holder is to select a subset of attributes to present. And that goes back to the point of selective disclosure, which is one of those principles that we saw earlier, the principles of self-sovereign identity around minimalization and being able to not present your whole self and only the parts of yourself that you need to assert in order to achieve that, that next step, that next job to be done. And this goes back to the academic profile curation that we talked about earlier and the promise of presenting your best self. The attributes that we're talking about, and this is part of the evolving landscape, they're based on available schemas and proof templates. Now, an institution, of course, can have and typically will have its own unique schema, but there will be other schemas and indeed proof templates that institutions and verifiers can use and borrow from. And you have a lot of initiatives rather globally at the moment working on just that in terms of defining and supporting these types of mechanisms. The key here again goes back to the point of selective disclosure and back to the principle or one of the key principles of self-sovereign identity. And ultimately what we want to get to, in fact, with some of these concepts is the idea of a zero knowledge proof. And a zero knowledge proof is essentially asserting something about myself without disclosing everything about myself. I guess the most common or the simplest example of that being, say, my proof of age, where I wouldn't need to disclose, say, my date of birth or my name and address like you might find on a, say, driver license, in order to, to tell someone or to assert that I am at the age of majority or something similar, something like that. And finally, with the proofs, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to share these easily. And we want to be able to share these securely in an environment that supports us and also focuses on again, going back to our job to be done. So let's have a quick example of a proof request. Now, this is a completely made up university application form. And this is an application to, again, a made up university or college called Winston's College. And what we're going to do here is, in applying for it, we've sort of, I'm sure most people have applied for a university, gone through one of these university application processes. They're quite long processes. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of nerves going around because it's all about your life and your onward education and employability and so forth. So it's quite a stressful time. And one of the trickier parts is when you start to collate and compile all the different, credentials or education credentials that you've achieved in order to support your application. So what we've done here is, and this is very manufactured. This example, above all else, was really for us to complete that search.
Sorry to interrupt, Takis, but I'm looking at the time, so we have still 10 minutes, and we want to have some time, of course, from some questions. So
we do. There's only a couple more after this.
Okay, thank you.
I'll go through this fairly quick. So this uses an embedded widget. Mm-hmm. And what we've got is it's dropped onto the application here. And after we establish a connection, what we want to do is basically ship our verifiable credential that we were issued earlier. So you can see here, we're adding a new qualification. they're going to go down and they're going to select the verifiable credential from a digital wallet. And at this point, it's going to create a QR code. And again, this goes back to creating that trust channel. So we're actually going to create another set of private identifiers or private pairwise DIDs between the application in this case, and again, yes, it is represented as Digitary, and the learner. And then the proof request will come in based on the attributes that we talked about. And what they would like to know in this case is their name, the certificate issuer, the date it was conferred, their major, GPA, and so forth. So you'll pick some of those various bits of information, and then the learner will attach those back to their university application. Now, this is a simplified, like I said, this is a simplified demonstration, but a good capability demonstration of how you can use your verifiable credential to support a second process, like, for example, admission into another degree. And you can see in this case, again, for us, we've captured those attributes and we've presented them back on the screen as a part of your education history to support your application. Boom. Okay, so what are our takeaways and critical paths? So before, we used to assert who we are through other agencies like social networks and so forth. And all of these federated identity models and others have their inherent security risks, and obviously they're very attractive to bad actors. What self-sovereignty starts to allow us to do is it starts to allow us to take control as the holders of the credential, where we assert who we are on our terms. And as a learner, what you end up doing is supporting your best self. Now, one of the key things that we did learn in terms of the technology, the use cases, the user experience, and some of the different components that we built was focus on the problem that we're trying to solve. Focus on the job to be done. Focus on the fact that you'd like the learner to get from A to B and so forth. And that actually helped us solidify not only where we wanted to go, but also it helped us align and realign. And finally, the importance of the philosophical underpinnings of self-sovereignty and what it means more broadly, and with a self-sovereign ecosystem more globally, how it will help us assert who we are and take more control of who we are in all manner of our digital lives. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the questions so far as well. They were quite good. And I hope this has given you at least a good introduction or a solid introduction, not only on some of the values and the philosophical principles underpinning self-sovereignty, but also with some of those examples and the demo, how you can perhaps start to think of using the actual technology to achieve self-sovereignty for your learners. Thanks,
Okay.
Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Takis, for a very clear introduction and overview, and also gives also with the demo a very clear view what could this possibly be meaning. And we have indeed some questions, and very interesting questions, also challenging questions for you. And I will starting you pick one from the Q&A of Herman de Leeuw. And that's a question you probably will be prepared for. Is this wallet just a Digitary wallet, or how do you see that? Yeah, is it something that other wallets can interact? What is the place of Digitary in this?
Okay, this is an interesting question, and we get this a little bit. What about the wallet? Can I white label the wallet? Can I do all sorts of things with the wallet? The short is no. Well, firstly, the wallet that I demonstrated there is not ours. It's from a company called Evany, and that's their Connect Me app. It's their digital wallet. Now, it is an open source application, and it can be, theoretically, it can be white labeled if that's what you wanted to do, and it's a very viable option if that's what you wanted to do. The key, however, and some of the the premise of self-sovereignty, and if you saw some of those connections that we created there between different entities, between the University of Western Hobart and between Winston's College during the proof request, we kept collecting identifiers and we kept collecting connections within our digital wallet. Now, if you take that beyond learning, if you take that to your banking, if you take that to your financial institutions, to your medical insurance companies, to government, to all manner of things that sort of, I guess, are part of our digital lives, you eventually end up with what would probably be hundreds or thousands of these connections. Now, you don't want hundreds or thousands of apps or even tens or hundreds of apps to represent a sector, like this is my finance one or this is my medical one or whatever. So ideally, you want to get to a point where the digital wallet was a consolidation of all of these connections. And as you collect hundreds and thousands, there'll be mechanisms and features within that wallet to easily navigate it, to support proof requests, to suck in additional verifiable creds, and so forth.
Okay, thank you. But I presume also that what you also try to say is that you'll be having multiple wallets in the world interacting with multiple systems. It's a decentralized
Correct.
system in the general way. Yeah? So, but that is of course the emerging market. I have also a question maybe on another spectrum, of course, of James Cavey, and he is asking the notion of credential fluency. He's starting using that notion in his research. Do you have any views on that? Is this a term that you, or maybe
No,
James,
sorry,
if you have, you can also unmute yourself, I think, and maybe ask your question, if that's possible.
Is that,
yes?
So do we mean in terms of understanding, hi James, do we mean in terms of understanding what the credential represents in a more universal way or something more specific?
Oh, I think you've unmuted me. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I don't want to take time. It's just about the fact that these credentials are so much more interrelated now, and it was my point around the OECD definitions. I think the classical distinction between formal, non-formal, informal will probably dissipate going forward. And the currency of the learning is more than the currency that the university provides to it, but the currency becomes linked to the employability. Your point, Taki, is a bit earlier. That this currency, I think we'll find a new currency emerging in the future as the fluency or this interrelatedness of credentials becomes more dominant. And it's just an interesting discussion. And thank you very much. Great presentation.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I completely agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. And that's what we're getting to. And we're getting to, see, I also think that's what some of those curation aspects that I sort of talked about a little bit earlier as well, sort of getting to, and how we're represented and the value of different credentials and the crossover with formal and informal. And in fact, if you look at the current environment around COVID times, especially down here in Australia, the government has gone to great pains to essentially introduce reskilling initiatives based on different types of credentials and credentialing mechanisms and measures of education attainment and so forth. So the space is rapidly changing in the environment that we find ourselves in has become a trigger for a lot of these things to sort of go full pelt.
Okay, anyone other questions? I don't see any appearing in the Q&A or in the chat. But I have also, in the meantime, another question, because this is, of course, an interesting, of course, I say that from a personal opinion of very biased, but this is a disruption that is emerging. But of course, it will be a bit for individual university or maybe individual governments, a bit overwhelming. So I don't know if you have any advice, what the position of individual university that will be the main actor, or maybe students, what they should do in those kind of things. So do she pilot or do she wait until this system is established? What is your opinion on the current position?
Sorry, so can you repeat that?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I want to ask you, what do you think universities, government should do to improve those kind of things? Huh?
Yeah, look, I think the key part of everything that we're doing, because it is maturing quite rapidly, but adoption or real adoption, frankly, has been quite slow. We actually what we'd like to see universities and governments invest as much as they possibly can. Again, current times have made things tricky, but current times have also provided a unique opportunity I don't think we would have seen otherwise. So For example, with Digitary at the moment, we are fishing for pilot partners. And we're fishing for pilot partners to take the proof of concept that you saw in the example earlier and to take it to a real scenario, perhaps with one of our existing partners or perhaps with someone else. So we'd like to, again, encourage institution. We know the interesting thing about this is we know a number of institutions are playing with this stuff on their own. We know a number of institutions are trying to find different ways to identify their learners, some of the challenges around overseas students coming into their institutions from all over the world. We know that there's a lot of labs, excuse me, in a number of these institutions. And we also know, and we're also members or contributing to a number of global initiatives. There's ILR and SSI being led really from the US, but taking on a more of a global flavor as it sort of moves across as well. W3C is playing a critical role in advancing the standards and supporting a standards framework where people can come together and discuss. So what we'd like to see is organizations, government, universities take that next leap. Take the leap so that we're able to go we're able to go into that new world. And these ecosystems are happening. Banks are looking at it. Financial institutions are looking at it. We know that medical insurance firms are looking at it. The broader or the wider that ecosystem, the critical mass, if you like, that critical mass, the closer we get to that critical mass, the more value these things will be. So yeah, for me, take a dip, do it. Invest in what is an undeniable future for the way that we assert who we are.
Indeed, and in the chat in the Q&A also, James has mentioned, indeed with the COVID and all this thing, pandemic aspects, the digital interaction will be more important, and this can indeed help in those aspects. And of course, another suggestion is indeed the qualification agencies. They have, I presume, also a role in that. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. The qualification agencies, indeed, the qualification frameworks that often come out of departments of government departments for employment and so forth. Yeah, absolutely. They supply that technical underpinning. They supply some of those key foundational elements that support how these credentials can be articulated. They could theoretically be able to feed into how some of these credentials are defined, whether the schemas and the attributes that are involved, how some of the proofs could theoretically, or what could determine the validity perhaps of the proof in the attributes. There's different ways a lot of these frameworks could feed into this process. And again, that goes back to if we're interested in qualification frameworks, that is a critical role for government to fill.
And also related with the remark or the question that Herman de Leeuw has also in the Q&A, that is of course ENIC and NAREC network. Are you aware of their activity or focus in this area, or?
Not specifically.
Yeah.
I do know, no, my short answer is I'm not specifically aware of what ENIC and NAREC are potentially doing. So they're networks that also support global learner mobility and so forth. And it's interesting between the formal, informal, non-formal sort of learning mechanisms that we've currently got. I think organizations like that are also very important and critical to the charge. I'm not super familiar with what ENIC and NAREC are doing specifically with self-sovereignty or how they're dipping into some of the other initiatives. But I'd be certainly curious to find out.
Yeah. Maybe to answer that, from our side, from the European side, we had some interaction with ENIC and NAREC because they were also challenging or trying to solve the same problem of mobility. So we had some interaction with them, but we need to check what the latest status is. But I know they are interesting in those new concepts, seeing what they could provide. Now, unfortunately, we're a bit running out of time. We could discuss, of course, a long time, and maybe it's also a suggestion to Groningen Net Regulation that we continue this discussion because it's, of course, not limited. But maybe one last question to close before I give the floor back to Melanie for closing remarks. But how do you see the transition? Maybe a long question, but we are now in an interesting disrupting this technology. But what is your prediction that is coming to go live? No? Or when do you see that? Is there something in 20 years? Will we be living it, or how do you see this? No?
Not definitely not 20 years. I would like to measure it in months, not years. I think realistically we might be years from achieving that critical mass that I mentioned earlier, and by that I mean a critical mass not only in the sort of mechanisms that would support learners, that is learning institutions and onward, but I'm talking about the critical mass for self-sovereignty globally, bringing all manner of different sort of sectors that we deal with in our daily lives, in our digital lives in particular. I measure it in months. The other aspects of it are the learning aspects, in particular the academic creds in particular, because I'm encouraged by some of the initiatives that have kicked off. I'm encouraged by some of the stuff we're seeing out of the ILR community and some of the innovation networks that are happening in North America. I'm encouraged as well by some of the European initiatives that have kicked off also. We know that there are a number of institutions globally, North America, Europe, or, even here in Australia, who are looking at piloting, albeit internally, some of these initiatives. So for me, I actually do think that we will be seeing academic credentials coming out of, or rather academic credentials on self-sovereign networks by 2021, mid-2021 or thereabouts, if not sooner. Whether that is in a, let's call it a beta or proof of concept phase, I guess is yet to be seen, and it's probably likely. But again, I'm so encouraged by some of these broader initiatives and indeed the appetite by higher education institutions for this sort of tech to support what they're doing, to sort of see that future, I guess, become a reality.
Okay, and Herman anticipated on that engagement for within a year. So he's inviting you to the next GDN annual meeting in Ottawa to present the results. So take that challenge up to see where we are in the year on this challenge. So I think Herman, challenge taken.
Absolutely. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What a great story to tell from where we are now. Let's say into next year. To see where we've gotten, reflecting on what we said, what we talked about, what we predicted, how close or how far will we land. I think that's a hell of a challenge. That's great.
Okay, we'll take that, Herman, and we'll be watching the prediction that we did in this video. Okay, Takis, I think we can close this session. So thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, and also the interesting questions and interesting answers that you provided. I'm going to close the session by giving back the floor to Melanie, not without thanking you, everybody, for your presence in this early morning or late night. For Melanie, very early morning. But I hope you enjoyed the session and stay tuned because there are more sessions. So Melanie, up to you. You are still muted, Melanie, if you want to say something.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And this brings to a close the 4th webinar in the Groningen Declaration Network's annual meeting webinar series. I would like to thank our sponsors and also our presenters for this very engaging and informative presentation. We hope that you'll join us for the next webinar in the series that will be on Tuesday, July 21st on the topic of lifelong learning, collaborations and innovations in Asia Pacific. Look for part 2 of the annual meeting webinar series, which will be a next series of 5 beginning in September. Visit the GroningenDeclaration.org for more information or to register. And finally, we are very much looking forward to the 10th annual meeting to be held in Ottawa in May of 2021. We hope to see you there physically, as we all hope that live meetings, in-person meetings will resume. Thank you again, and this concludes our webinar presentation today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you. Bye.